Hello, sports card collectors. Today at thepit.com, we're going to be trying to answer a very common question that people ask when it comes to sports card collecting. And that question is, should I buy a PSA 9 of a card or a PSA 10 of a card? Which is the better long-term value when it comes to investment, or just when it comes to buying cards generally for collection purposes and collection building purposes. So today we're going to use uh, a pretty good, big example of this to try to answer this question. So the card we're looking at today is Kobe Bryant's 1996 SP PSA graded rookie card. So this card, uh, I think a lot of people understood, was undervalued for a very long time. This was a card that even a year ago, you could find this card for as low as $50, which is a pretty staggering, crazy thought. Considering what a legend Kobe was on and off the field. But there you have it. This is a card that you could actually pick up pretty cheap. You could have $100 and potentially get a deal and get a couple of these. And of course, with his tragic passing, there was a huge run on his cards. And during that period, his rookie cards were going for 10 times what they were before. And the pit actually did sell one of these around that time for about $800. And since then, this card has settled back down to the $550, $600 range. And Pit actually does have one listed for $549. But as you can see, this is not a card that sells that often. And if we take a look at the PSA report, population report for this card, so there's 6,700 of these graded by PSA, and only 847 of those are graded a PSA 10. Whereas with the PSA 9s, there's almost 3,000. So you could reasonably expect that about half of those graded would come back 9s, and maybe about 15% of those might come back at 10. So 10s are pretty rare. And a lot of times the general feeling among investors is that the PSA 10 is the card you should always target because it typically has the best return on investment long term, simply because of scarcity. And there is some validity to that argument. But as you can see, if you bought this card for say $800 a few months ago, there's no way you could turn a profit on it now. I mean, of course, when he actually does get inducted in the Hall of Fame, I'm sure we're going to see another run on his cards. But this is where the PSA 9 comes in. So the PSA 9 is obviously much more common. It's about 3.5 times more common than the PSA 10. But this is the important thing to take away from this, is if you take a look, this card was, you could actually pick these up for 11 or 12 bucks of a year ago. And we're going to take a look at the price history on this card. So this goes back to December. So this is the last 6 months. In December, you could see people were pretty readily selling this card for under $20. So this was under $20 card in PSA 9. But of course, with his passing, the price jumped up very quickly, up into the 30s and 40s and 50s. And as the as the market for his cards really took off, I mean, this card jumped all the way to $100. It jumped within the space of a month, or a month or so, from $20 to $100. And and it actually got as high as $160. And then it came back down to where it is now, around $85. Was the last sale that we had. But right now these are being listed for around $100, $110. So what's interesting about the PSA 9 is that the PSA 9, if you actually ask a lot of collectors, many collectors will actually focus on a PSA 9 rather than a PSA 10 because, well, for several reasons. So when you have a PSA 9, the difference between a PSA 9 and a PSA 10 oftentimes is not really that large. We'll get into it later, but for example, the difference between a BGS 9 and say a BGS 9.5 is a lot bigger than the difference between a PSA 9 and a PSA 10. You could actually argue that on a good day, there are PSA 9s that could have passed as PSA 10s and PSA 10s that probably should have been PSA 9s. So because PSA does not have that half grade, they don't have a 9.5. A lot of people actually argue that they should. Because of of situations like this where there's so many more nines and tens. But what's happened in the market is people have realized that the PSA 9, first of all, it's a mint condition card. If you look at the card and you look at a 9 and you look at a 10, the difference in eye appeal is usually, pretty much. I mean, if you look at those two cards side by side, um, they really don't look that different. So, usually all that holds it back from being a 10 is a very, very slight imperfection. Maybe one of the corners has a little bit of whitening, or one of the edges is slightly chipped, or, maybe the centering isn't absolutely perfect on the front and back. But the differences are usually so minor. But the price difference between a 9 and a 10 is staggering. But the problem with the 10s, and obviously, depending on the card, some tend to sell extremely well. But when it comes to cards, especially like Kobe Bryant, a card that a lot of people want, well, most people are not going to spend $550 on one card. They'd much rather spend, say, $80 to $100 on a card. And so long term, if you bought these cards a year ago, I mean, you were doing extremely well for yourself right now. Because and this card went from $20 a year ago. Even 6 months ago, this card was you could get easily for $20, and now you'd be lucky to get one for $100. So that's a 5 times return. Whereas on the PSA 10, you could have bought them years ago, but as far as liquidity purposes, the PSA 9 just sells so much more often. And I mean, it's been generally understood that Kobe cards are actually pretty undervalued. Compared to others, but just to show that if you're trying to decide, should I pony up the cash and get a PSA 10, or should I instead buy a PSA 9, or a multiple PSA 9s. Say that you want to invest in Kobe Bryant, and watch his cards go up over time. It makes a lot more sense to spend your $500 and $600. Does it make more sense to spend your $500 or $600 buying multiples of his PSA 9 or the PSA 10? So what I can say is that what it seems to be recently, especially, is that the PSA 9s have started to gain a lot in value. Whereas in the past few years, if you didn't get a 10, it was considered a massive disappointment. That's not really the case anymore. So there's definitely value in both the PSA 9. So the difference with the PSA 10 is there simply aren't going to be that many of them. But only about 1.5 out of 10 are going to grade a 10. So essentially, it all depends on what your goal is. Are you trying to get the scarcest, rarest version of a card, or are you just looking to own that card in your collection? If you're trying to diversify among multiple players, buying 9s can be a good strategy. So there's advantages and disadvantages to buying 10s. Of course, if there's a big run, the 10 is going to multiply much more quickly than this card. PSA 10s can go up 6 to 8 times, whereas the 9s typically maybe 3 or 4 times. So there's definitely an advantage to buying a 10 if you're looking for the scarcity. And essentially, if you're not worried about having to flip that card immediately, buying a 10 is a lot better. Whereas 9s are more liquid. You can move them within a shorter time frame. So it's all about, for me, buying a PSA 10 or buying a PSA 9 all comes down to how quickly how quickly you're trying to sell this card. So obviously, if you want a PSA 10 and you're not planning on selling it anytime soon, a PSA 10 is a good choice. But if you're looking to buy a bunch of cards and then sell the extra copies to make a profit in the near future, then the 9 might be the way to go. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. What do you think? Do you think buying the PSA 10 is worth the potential long-term gains due to scarcity, or do you think buying the PSA 9s is a better strategy since you can get multiple copies or be able to buy, just one card at a significantly lower price point? Really love to hear your thoughts on this. Have a great weekend, everybody, and happy collecting.